日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and today Nate is here with me.
Hello, everybody.
All right, and today, Nate's been doing some research on the Ouchi clan and the Battle of Funaokayama in particular, at least for one particular paper. So we're going to talk about the Ouchi clan and the battle and sort of the surrounding events. So just to kind of get everyone on the same page here, the Ouchi clan is a Western clan. Probably most known for the Sengoku era activities involving the Amako and the Mori and their interactions with the Ashikaga shogunate. So the focus of this episode would be the early 16th century when Ouchi Yoshioki was in charge. And as we mentioned sort of off the microphone, he's the father of Yoshitaka, who was, I guess, kind of a slacker who lost the clan to the rebellion of Sue Harukata. And then Harukata, in turn, was crushed by the Mori. But that's what we got, so that's where we're going.
That's pretty much the stereotype of the Sengoku, right?
Yeah, so let everyone know, I guess, how you got onto this particular topic, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so this was started as a project last fall in a class that I'm taking, or that I took with Professor Thomas Conlon, who's my advisor here in grad school, and it was a class focused on learning how to read period documents. So things from the late Heian through the early Sengoku periods to kind of give a rough estimate. I think we talked about we did a podcast about kind of like just the problems with reading documents in general and so on. So I won't rehash that, but this ended up being my final paper for the class, and I decided to take a look at, we had done one document, and I believe that I talked about it in that podcast, that was a document of praise related to the Battle of Funaokayama. So it was signed by Ouchi Yoshioki and sent to one of his subordinates for, praising his, it's basically like an award letter, right? You've done great things. Thank you. Here's a document from Yoshioki that your descendants can have forever to, lay claim to their heritage and service and so on. So anyway, funny thing, and we can touch on this later, but Professor Conlon went to Japan this summer, and we got some corrections on our translations of that letter. But anyway, so since that was one of the letters that I had translated in class, and of course my interest being military history, battles, and so forth, I was trying to think. We had to do a final paper where we looked at documents and came up with an analysis of something. It was kind of broad in what we could do. So I decided, well, I'll go through one series of documents, and I will look at all the documents related to the Battle of Funaokayama. It wasn't I didn't go through multiple volumes of sources to pull everything. So I looked at the 43 documents concerning the battle in the Dai Nihon Shiryo series of compiled sources. So this is kind of an older set of texts. The volume I was looking at, or the volumes I was looking at, were from 1932. So published by Tokyo Imperial University. But they're letters sent back and forth by different people that address either the situation before the battle or after the battle, or what was going on. So I looked at these, and I really didn't go into it with any particular ideas. It was mostly just, okay, what can I know and what can these tell me? And I intentionally did not look at any narrative sources, so I didn't read any like diary entries of people who were there or had heard about it and what they wrote about the battle. It was merely these sort of official documents, these letters that served as hey, you did this and I'm rewarding you for it, or submissions. I think we talked in the podcast about the letters and different documents, the submissions of service. I showed up with my 20 men at this such and such time, and we fought bravely, and I submit this to you humbly for so that you can reward me and pay me and stuff like that. So that was kind of like the genesis of the project.
Okay, so before we get started, how about you give us a background of the Ouchi clan around that time and Ouchi Yoshioki in particular? And also,
Okay.
you can also mention Conlin's interest in the whole Ouchi clan too.
Yeah, Conlon. I don't want to say too much necessarily because number one, he's working on a project on the Ouchi, and that'll be coming out eventually. So I don't want to steal too much thunder there from my boss. But the other thing is, I mean, quite honestly, he knows so much about the Ouchi that it's frightening sometimes. Like, there's a couple comments when I got my paperback where I'm going through and pulling information from reputable secondary sources to kind of put together my understanding of the history of the Ouchi, and he's got comments like, "No, that was completely wrong. They were there much earlier than that." And he knows this because he's gone through all the not only the normally published primary sources, but the random documents that they have at certain shrines in Yamaguchi and so on. So I can kind of give a very basic overview, but I fully admit that I am not an expert on the Ouchi, and anything that he publishes later is probably going to be it's probably gonna contradict anything I say because I'm still learning. But basically, like you said, they were a Western family centered around Yamaguchi. That was their headquarters. They had been prominent certainly as early as the Nambokucho, and the Ashikaga takeover, and were one of the families that had been one of the major Shugo daimyo during the Ashikaga shogunate. They kind of had an interesting relationship, I think, with the Ashikaga, in that they weren't really. I mean, we've talked in previous podcasts about the structure of the Ashikaga shogunate, but you had the shogun, but then you had this subordinate layer of families underneath them, and some of them had been traditional Ashikaga retainers. I think most of them had, actually, and then some of them had just been powerful families that had supported the Ashikaga during at one point or another. I guess by the end, anyway. During the Nambokucho Wars. So the Ouchi, I think, fall in the latter category, had been in the Yamaguchi area for quite a long time. Some of our listeners may know Yamaguchi. Yeah, it's Yamaguchi Prefecture now. The area around there is often called Choshu, especially when you're talking about the Bakumatsu period. So that may be what our listeners are more familiar with. But if you think about the island of Honshu and going all the way down to the western end, past where Shikoku is underneath it, down to the tip where it crosses over to, you have the strait, and then there's Kyushu. They basically ruled the western tip, and at various points in their history, gained more and more land to the east. So by the time we get to Yoshioki, he's the shugo of Aki, Iwami, Suo, and Nagato. So 4 provinces. And allegedly, at least according to their house lineage, he's the 30th head of the Ouchi house. Conlon says that's a complete fabrication. I'm inclined to believe him rather than, constructed documents trying to create a family history. And they, interestingly enough, which many of our listeners may not know, the Ouchi claim descent from a Korean prince rather than what most families in this time traced their lineage back to either the Taira, Minamoto, or Fujiwara as their Uji. And we've talked about the concept of Uji versus Ie before, so people can go back and listen to that stuff. But the Ouchi were different. They claimed the Tatara as their Uji name, and they claimed this because they claimed descent from a Korean prince who had immigrated over from one of the Korean kingdoms. I want to say Paekche, but don't quote me on that. Nobody cite me in a source on their paper on that. Go back and look for it yourself. But came over and was, during the time, I think, when Shilla was conquering their neighbors. But instead of just kind of seamlessly immigrating in, sort of maintained a separate Tatara identity. And so the Ouchi clung on to this. And of course, whether this is true or not, your guess is as good as mine. But interestingly enough, the Ouchi of our time, so Yoshioki and his predecessors, use this as a way to reach out to Korea and try to establish independent relations with Korea, primarily so that they can establish independent trade connections, right? Of course, the Koreans were like, who the heck are you? We don't know anything about this. What are you talking about? But the Ouchi believed that they were descended from these Korean princes, and that this should give them a connection to the Chosun court, and so tried to leverage that. So interesting side bit, but the fact that they are, I know Professor Conlon will go into much greater detail on that when he gets around to his book, but there's all sorts of interesting stories about how they trace their lineage, and there's a story I can't exactly remember, but it involves being descended from a star, all sorts of craziness, right? So anyway, the point that I'm trying to get to anyway is that the Ouchi were not your typical Shugo daimyo family tracing themselves back to one of the 3 main Uji in Japan that everybody else did. And so they kind of, especially by the time we get to Yoshioki, dance to the beat of their own drum, so to speak. So they're active, of course, through the Onin War and involved on the western side, right? And then they're one of the few of the larger daimyo families that don't completely collapse because, how we talked about it in the past, where many of the larger families, Shugo daimyo or Shugo, were, brought their armies and were fighting around the capital, and their provinces that they had control of kind of collapsed in their absence, or at least descended into some sort of chaotic control by underlings who maybe weren't necessarily working on their behalf. The Ouchi didn't really like that. I don't want to. I haven't reviewed Onin specifics recently, so I don't want to misspeak too much. But they were involved, but they didn't. They also spent a lot of time back at Yamaguchi, not just camped out in the capital. So they didn't quite suffer the same fate that a lot of the other, like the Amako or the Hatakeyama, some of the others did. So Yoshioki was born in 1477 and took over from his father Masahiro in 1495. And then, so I don't know that we've ever actually talked about what happens after the Onin War official dates. Have we?
I don't know. Maybe very briefly in one of the very early History of Japan podcast
maybe in a
episodes.
very early podcast. Okay, so to kind of sketch a little bit, and we may be going too deep into backstory here, but whatever, right? Okay, so most people know the dates of the Onin as 1466 to 1477. And I think most people understand, or at least most of our listeners would understand, that 1477 isn't really an end to fighting. It's just kind of, at that point, everything has fizzled out in the capital area. So the quote-unquote Hosokawa versus the Yamana, like, image of the, East versus West of the Onin War is said to come to a close. And then that's, after that, or as part of that is where we get the whole, and everything devolves, and, Kyoto no longer has control of everything, the Ashikaga no longer have control of everything, and all the daimyo rise up in the provinces and just kind of do their own thing, and we call it the Sengoku period, and everybody's just killing everybody else until we get to Oda Nobunaga killing anybody who opposes him, and then, la-di-da-di-da, right? So that's, obviously a very strict generalization. The Ouchi are consolidating control over their provinces, the four that I mentioned, Aki, Iwami, Suo, and Nagato. Their primary base was Suo and Nagato. And Aki is interesting, and this is actually getting into some of the body of my paper. Aki was interesting because they were not originally in control of Aki, and Aki was a province primarily controlled not by one overarching Shugo daimyo, but by a group of not too smaller families, but some smaller families, such as the Masuda. Aki, one of the provinces that the Ouchi were trying to gain control of. And they were named Shugo of Aki at some point. Yoshihiro was. I'm sorry, not Yoshihiro. Yoshioki was. But Aki, like, just because you were named Shugo of a province does not automatically just denote that you have complete autonomy and control over it, right? And one of the ways that the Ashikaga kind of kept their Shugo daimyo in semi-check, you can debate whether it worked or not, was that they had another set of families kind of below the Shugo daimyo, but that reported directly to them, stationed in various places around the provinces. So these are variously known as kokujin, or more specifically, what I'm referring to in this instance is the hokoshu. If you take the characters and sort of translate it, it comes out to like the public service band, right? So these are the retainers. These are the people out in the provinces who reported directly to the shogun rather than to, the shugo themselves, right? And so in order to keep the Shugo daimyo or the Shugo from developing too much independent power, they kind of use these hokoshu as sort of like a break, right? As like a check on them. Like, so it's sort of in the Ashikaga's interest to make sure that there's a tension between, the Shugo of a province and then any hokoshu who have land in that province and are primarily based in that province, so that the Shugo daimyo don't get too powerful and able to completely ignore the authority of Kyoto. Does that make sense? I kind of like went around that a roundabout way, I guess, but
Yeah, that
does
makes
that work?
sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So many people might be familiar with the term Gokinin. These were usually Gokinin families. Often that's translated as vassals. I have been slapped on the wrist for using the term vassals, but because of its feudal connotations, and we're trying to get away from that idea. But if you're familiar with Gokinin as a concept, then that's one of the groups that we're talking about, right? So we have this, it ends up with this triangular interplay of power relationships. So you got the military governors receiving appointments. Military governors is the shugo, right? To keep peace in the provinces. And they use that authority to solidify their control over local bands of warriors. But to keep those military governors from establishing too strong a provincial power base, the shogun has these direct ties with local kokujin, naming them hokoshu, or his direct, directly responsible to him, bypassing the shugo. So then the kokujin could then play the middle between the two in order to best guarantee their semi-autonomy from the local or provincial shugo. That's probably a more succinct way to put it. So if you want to cut all the other and just put that, it's fine. Okay. So out of these documents that I looked at, right, several of them were several of the addressees that Ouchi Yoshioki sent documents to were kokujin from these from these areas, right? Primarily in Aki. So Takahashi, Hiraga, Kobayakawa, Amano, Tagaya, Watanabe, Ogasawara, and Akana are all listed as kokujin in various sources, and were hokoshu, so direct retainers of the Ashikaga. So I guess the best way to put kind of like where my research in this project went was I originally started the paper thinking, okay, I study military tactical battles in a way that I need to kind of understand how the army is organized. I mean, we've talked about this however many times, especially in reference to Nagashino. You want to establish kind of like okay, who was at the battle, what type of forces did they have, how many forces did they have, so that you understand how they used them. Well, the problem with a battle like Funaokayama is you don't have really anything. It's not like studying some of the levies that Hideyoshi drew up saying, hey, Shimazu, you will give me X amount of soldiers and we'll deploy them to Korea. Like, you don't get these wonderful lists like some of the other work that I'm doing these days. So this is obviously a challenge for me trying to even figure out what the heck happened at Funaokayama, right? So I was like, all right, well, let me look at the actual documents themselves and see if I can map out a sort of rudimentary chain of command and get an idea of who I would be looking at to then investigate kind of what holdings they have. So, the next step after that would be, okay, the Masuda family is being issued orders by Yoshioki. Okay, so we'll say that they fall under his control. Then how do I look, then let's look at what the Masuda had as their holdings and kind of generate an idea of, okay, well, they could have supported X amount of soldiers and so forth, and try to construct a rough outline of the army that way. Obviously, that's way beyond the scope of what, one semester-long paper was going to be. But I just kind of wanted to see if I could lay that out, so to speak, right? So what I found is it's obviously not that easy at all. Okay, so the documents that I looked at is 43 documents issued immediately before and after the battle. Okay, 26 were signed by Ouchi Yoshioki, 6 were signed by the Ashikaga Yoshitada, and 2 by the deputy shogun Hosokawa Takakuni, and 9 were signed by various subordinates thereof. Of these, 33 were classified, or I classify them as praise for actions on the battlefield. 3 of those include specific reference to rewards. 4, so 3 of them before the battle and 1 after, are orders directing service, specific instructions. 2 of them are submissions by warriors of casualty lists for those under their command. And then the remaining 4 express gratitude for support, condolence, or presentations of rewards. So of the documents signed by Yoshioki, 21 are praise for battle leads and 3 are orders. Okay, and I have a full breakdown of the documents, and Chris, if you want to kind of take that, like, you can post that and some of my diagrams as a
yeah, I can put it on the
as
podcast,
pictures
the podcast
up on the
blog.
podcast. Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. That's fine.
Okay.
That way, because one of the other things I wanted to do is figure out how to visually represent these things, right? So that's the numerical breakdown. Why is this important? Well, as we learned in class, and as you go through documents, you see this. Who writes what document to whom, using like what terms, is very important, especially up through this time. When you get into like the later Sengoku, kind of the formats break down a little bit. But the Ouchi, Conlon always likes to point out that the Ouchi in particular, even through the Sengoku, as long as they existed, held on to these older forms of documentary address, right? So they're very consistent with what you would find in, when you go back and look at Nambokucho records, when you look at Kamakura period records, they're very similar, okay? So all of these formats are very indicative of the power relationships between the person sending it and the person receiving it. And sometimes they may be an indication of what the person sending it wants that power relationship to be, if you kind of follow what I'm saying. Like, it may not necessarily be that person is of a position to write the letter that they're writing, but they're trying to do so, okay? So what I get into with it and what I find is that these documents show kind of this competition that I talked about between the shogun, the shugo, right, the military governor, and the hokoshu, because you have documents being issued by Ouchi Yoshioki, who is the shugo, that if you go by like the book rules, should be coming from the shogun. But he's issuing these. So it's interesting because he's trying, like, it's very clear that he is trying to establish his authority over, specifically in the documents that I look at, the hokoshu, these these families that are directly subordinate to the shogun in Aki and Iwami and some of the other areas that Ouchi Yoshioki is trying to establish his personal control over. This is going on at the same time, and I should probably set up the specific context of the battle. We diverged and didn't get to do that, but we'll do that. We'll do that next. But that through, he's supporting the Ashikaga shogun, or at least his Ashikaga shogun, Yoshitada, and then, but at the same time, he's trying to do it in a way that carves out as big a power block for him and basically makes him the power broker within the shogunate, if that makes sense.
So now, looking at all of these documents, what did you get from the documents as far as like the run up to the battle, the actual battle immediately after? Is there any record of what happened like on the battlefield aside from who won? Records of the sort of like, we're going to have this guy do this is our plan, or even just who's coming to the battle? What sort of information were you able to gather that kind of paints a picture of the Battle of Funaokayama, or does this not really contain that sort of information?
So it's really sparse, and you have to do a lot of reading between the lines. The basic outline, as I'll give it to you, is this: that okay, so we have a conflict within the Ashikaga house, right? We've got the Ashikaga, basically two competitors for the post of shogun. We've got Ashikaga Yoshizumi and Ashikaga Yoshitada, and Yoshitada went by various names. I'm just going to use Yoshitada, which was his name at this particular time. Most people may know him as Yoshitane because that's the name that he used last. But for this paper, and so because I'm talking about this, I'm going to keep with that. Because all the documents that I was looking at listed him as Yoshitada, I stayed with Yoshitada just so that I didn't get confused. Otherwise, like, you get into the debate of, okay, do I call him Yoshiki? Do I call him Yoshitada? Or do I go with the name that he was known as last, and Yoshitane? And like, if I were doing this for publication, I would then clean it up and probably go with Yoshitane because that was his last. That was the name he was known by eventually to history. But for these purposes, I'm gonna just kind of keep on going with Yoshitada. This is one of those things that I asked, Professor Conlon his advice, and he was like, "Well, do whatever you want." So I am. Okay, so the bottom line, though, is Yoshitada had been pushed out of power and by Yoshizumi, and the power behind Yoshizumi was Hosokawa Sumimoto. So he was the son of Hosokawa Masamoto, who we'll know from Onion War fame. So continued on the Hosokawa family tradition of trying to run everything in the Bakufu, right? And Yoshizumi was his shogun, right? So Yoshitada gets kicked out in 1500, runs to Yamaguchi through a rather circuitous path, but that's not important right now. Runs to Ouchi Yoshioki in Yamaguchi, asking for help. Okay, so in 1507, Yoshioki raises his troops and marches on Kyoto to establish Yoshitada back in power. Okay, so Yoshizumi, there's a couple battles that go on. Yoshizumi flees to Omi, and Masamoto flees to Awa, and Yoshitada is reinstalled, and another Hosokawa Takakuni, is named as his deputy shogun. So, yay, Yoshitada's restored, right? Well, not so fast, okay? So then they, Yoshizumi, of course, is like, all right, yeah, I mean, this is how this went, right? You kick one out, and then he raises an army and comes back and kicks the other guy out, and vice versa. So it's now Yoshizumi's turn to raise his forces and come back in. So he contacts the Otomo, some of the Kokujin families of Aki and Iwami, who ostensibly are working with Ouchi Yoshioki, and tries to get them to rise up in the Ouchi's rear to cause trouble and force him to move back to the west. And then Sumimoto and Miyoshi Korenaga try to retake Kyoto in 1509 and are defeated. And Yoshizumi also tries to send an assassin to kill Yoshitada. It's got all this, like, this would be a very interesting period to novelize, I think, that we don't hear a whole lot about. I'm waiting for the reincarnation of Eiji Yoshikawa to have his crack at this. But anyway, so the story about the assassination is interesting. 1509, the 10th month of 1509, this assassin is sent to kill Yoshitada, and allegedly, according to various sources that I cannot corroborate, he was with a bunch of companions at a drinking binge in his quarters All of his companions pass out from drunkenness. The assassin comes in, and Yoshitada, despite having imbibed himself, is able to fight off the assassin. None of his companions wake up, but Yoshitada survives.
So it could have been a case of, man, you guys will never believe what happened while you were asleep.
It absolutely could have been. Or, one of his drunken companions came in and like mistaken identity. I mean, who knows, right? But that's the story. So anyway, so then fast forward a little bit to 1511, and you get the sense that like this whole idea of raising an army to come kick out your rival doesn't take it's not a quick process, right? It takes 7 years for Yoshitada to get the Ouchi to come and kick Yoshizumi out, and then 2 more years before we get to one attempt, and then 2 more years for another attempt by the Hosokawa and the Akamatsu, which is where we're at now. 7th month of 1511, Sumimoto and forms an alliance with the Akamatsu family, raise another army, and they advance into Izumi. The Hosokawa Takakuni, which remember is the Hosokawa who's working with the Ouchi, tries to stop him but is defeated and retreats to the city of Sakai. Then the Hosokawa Sumimoto and the Akamatsu forces besiege key castles, trying to set up their path to Kyoto, right? So Ouchi, Yoshioki, Yoshitada, and Hosokawa Takakuni are in retreat. So they decide they say, okay, we're going to leave Kyoto. We're going to abandon Kyoto and go find a better position. So this is where we get to the Battle of Funaokayama, because that's what they do. They move. Now you have to remember, Kyoto at the time was much smaller than what we imagine it now. So where the battle took place is actually in Kyoto City these days. It's actually if anyone is familiar with Kyoto and they've been to the Nishijin Textile Center, that's the battlefield. That's where it took place. So it's on the west side of Kyoto, not too far from the Abe no Seimei Shrine, if that helps people out. But anyway, so like we think of them leaving Kyoto. If you think of modern Kyoto, they didn't leave modern Kyoto. They left like the palace area, right? So then they left for Tamba, like I said, with a force of 25,000, and then the enemy, so Sumimoto and Masakata's troops, came with a much smaller force of 8,000 behind them, burned down Yoshitada and Takakuni's mansions, and interestingly enough, while all this was going on, Yoshizumi died of an illness on the 14th of the 7th month. Eighth month of 1511. So kind of like killed their whole cause, but they didn't know it at the time. Delays in information moving forward. So there's a little bit of debate about how orderly and like planned this withdrawal out of Kyoto to Tambo was. Conlon believes it was very calculated, and I tend to agree based off of the documents. I mean, some of the documents specifically say things like, we left the capital, we gathered in the capital and distributed our plan, or told you our plan, and then we left on this date, and then we just defeated the enemy at Funaokayama, and you did great service. That's pretty vague, but the continued pattern of that seems to indicate that like they gathered their forces in the capital and then intentionally moved out of it, that it wasn't a small group. So yeah, well that's where the frustration of trying to figure out what's going on really lies with this, because there is no like detailed plan. There is no like list of, oh, this person fought here and this person fought here. You kind of have to piece it all together, and different people piece it together different ways. If that if that makes sense, right? So, anyway, the battle itself happened on the 24th, and the forces of Hosokawa Masakata, who was working with Sumimoto, were routed fairly quickly, with, the, of course, hyperbolic statements in narrative sources. Everyone, there was no one that did not merit praise, and 3,800 heads were taken, and so on. But the bottom line is that the Hosokawa forces were destroyed. The Ouchi and Ashikaga Yoshitada forces were victorious, and then there was no more threat from them, right? So that's the story. The specifics appear to be that this was a retreat intended to draw in the enemy forces into attacking them at a specific position where they were defended and had more where the Ouchi, Ashikaga Yoshitada, and Hosokawa Takakuni side had more forces and were able to direct the battle. Now, I don't have nearly the amount of sources to really lay this out that I do in looking at a battle like Nagashino. And of course, the terrain has changed so much because, boom, the city of Kyoto is there now, that I can't. It's not like I can even go and look at the terrain all that well and try to figure out, okay, they set up on this ridge line or whatever. You can't do that. So it's really a challenge to get beyond what I just told you. Most of the tools that I've used, with my Nagashino analysis and some of the other things I've done, they just don't work. So it's actually a good exercise for me in that it forces me to really pull everything I can out of these documents.
All right, and that's it for another episode. So part 2 will be up in about a month or so, give or take. Nate will take the discussion a step further with a talk about the documents themselves and their historical usefulness and significance. And in the meantime, as always, please check us out on Patreon. Your patronage helps make this a better podcast. Patreon.com/Samurai Archives. Every little bit helps and is very appreciated. And donating this way gets you things like early access to new episodes, ability to vote on future episodes, and the ability to join the monthly Q&A sessions. And you can also find the other ways you can support the podcast by going to samuraipodcast.com. We've got some podcast t-shirts and stuff up there now that you can buy if you're so inclined, as well as all sorts of other neat stuff. And at samuraipodcast.com, you'll also find links to the books and articles that we talk about, as well as links to anything else mentioned in the podcast. So with that, we'll catch you next time. Thanks.